I've attended a lot of interviews, I've helped prepare a lot of people for interviews, and these are some frequently asked questions based on their feedback. So you want to watch this video to the end to answer some of these questions alongside me. Some of the responses which I'll be giving will make reference to our video on key AWS services which you must know before going in for interviews. You want to watch those videos? I've covered a lot of services, compute services, security services, network services, storage, database, and a lot more. So watch those videos because I'm making reference to them in responses which I am giving in this video. If this is your first time coming across our content, hit the subscribe button, and if you are a returning subscriber, thank you for watching our videos. Hit the notification bell, and let's dive right into our questions for today. Now these questions basically are AWS specific. The very first question which we'll be answering is, how will you handle high availability and scalability for an application that is hosted or running on AWS? If you have to respond to this question, the very first thing as far as availability is concerned is you want to talk about multi-easy deployment, deploying your applications in multiple availability zones across different regions. Of course, once you're doing multiple availability zone deployments, you are taking into consideration the cost. So if you're having an S3 bucket maybe in US East one region, you want to do a cross-region replication of that same bucket in another region. If you're having your resources in an EBS volume in maybe US West in one particular AWS region, one availability zone, you want to do a replication of your resources, your compute EBS volumes in another region. If you're having your databases, you want to create replicas or other versions of that application in another region. Also, as far as high availability is concerned, you want to look at different routing strategies. Amazon using maybe AWS Route 53 to make your availability more improved. So you use services like AWS CloudFront that will help for your content delivery networks to serve the application closest to your users. And equally, as far as routing your application based on AWS Route 53, there are different routing policies which you might use, geo proximity and failover or latency based routing policies to ensure that the users can equally have easy access to your applications. We want to talk about experience with CloudFront, with Route 53 for different routing strategies, and maybe hosting multi-easy deployments, and equally hosting, doing replication of your databases and replication of your data stored in your S3 buckets or your EBS volume, creating snapshots and a lot around that. For availability, you want to mention the usage of elastic load balancers that actually ensure availability. For availability and scalability, you want to mention the use of AWS elastic load balancers first to ensure that your traffic that is incoming into your infrastructure or that is incoming into your application is effectively routed between a fleet of EC2 resources or between a fleet of compute resources that are serving your application, that are configured in a target group or that are configured in a Kubernetes deployment or in an ECS service deployment. And then for scalability, you also want to make sure you use the principle of auto scaling on AWS. You want to use AWS auto scaling functionality for EC2 to ensure that the compute resource available will match traffic requirements. So auto scaling will help you to scale your traffic resources lower than or more than to meet the traffic requirement. And if you are talking about auto scaling specifically in your Kubernetes cluster, you always want to talk about horizontal port auto scaling for increasing and decreasing the number of ports to meet your traffic, or you want to talk about cluster auto scaling, because in interviews they'll always ask you about how have you performed auto scaling, or how maybe have you implemented an auto scaling functionality in your infrastructure. So as far as high availability and scalability is concerned, talk about Route 53, talk about CloudFront, talk about elastic load balancer, talk about auto scaling groups to ensure high availability and scalability of your application. Now the second question which they always ask a lot as far as AWS is concerned is how you ensure security and compliance for an application running on AWS, or what AWS security services have you made use of. As far as security on AWS is concerned, there are a lot of services, application security, network security services which you can use to ensure your application running safely on AWS. You want to start by talking about the identity and access management service, which AWS IAM, which ensures general access into the infrastructure. And by you mentioning IAM for identity and access management, talk detailedly on the usage of multi-factor authentication for root user accounts. Talk about the usage of policies, especially policies using the AWS least privilege policy model, where you give the right permissions to those required. And then you could want to talk about roles that grant access to particular services or particular accounts in AWS cloud. So You start with your usage of IAM for security. Then equally you have the network level of security, where you can use network access control lists to manage inbound and outbound traffic into your resources at the VPC level. And then equally, once you've gone past the VPC level, you want to talk about security for maybe instances in your Kubernetes cluster or in your ECS cluster or in your network itself, your VPC network. And you're talking about security groups, where you have certain traffic from particular IP addresses configured for your inbound and outbound traffic at the security group level. And equally for security, you want to talk about encryption and key management, where we have the AWS KMS service for the encryption of some devices on AWS or for some resources, especially elastic block store volumes, having your EBS volumes encrypted, and then having your data that is being transmitted encrypted both in transit and at rest. Then equally, you want to talk about AWS Web Access Firewall, AWS WAF, that also acts like a firewall for general access into your infrastructure. And of course, it sits at the level of you having maybe a Route 53 deployment for your DNS resolution, and then you have your WAF that actually tries to block maybe some malicious traffic getting into your application. So you want to talk about AWS WAF as far as security is concerned. Then equally, you want to talk about AWS Shield, because sometimes applications get downtime because of inaccessibility, and some of those attacks are caused by what we call denial of service, right? So you might have denial of service, and AWS has the dedicated denial of service attack mitigation strategy, which they use the service called AWS Shield. So you can use AWS Shield for dedicated denial of service attacks. For general monitoring of your environment, we can use guard duty for intelligent threat detection. That can be a security feature where your AWS environment is currently being monitored for threats. And then also, well, this is not like directly related to security, but of course you can mention CloudTrail that keeps a track all API calls made on AWS services in your environment. So along these services, or these services are some of the security services you can mention that will propose a good security posture for your application. So the third question, which is likely asked, is how you optimize costs for your AWS environment or for resources running on your AWS environment. And for cost optimization, there are a lot of factors across all the services that have to do with cost optimization. Simple storage service, S3 service on AWS. You want to talk about the various storage class which you use to store your data. So depending on your workload, you are using a particular AWS S3 bucket. You won't want to use an instant storage. You won't want to use a standard S3 bucket or an infrequent access or a frequent access S3 bucket for data that you won't be using for a long time. You can optimize cost first based on the data type which you're storing, and you having a mastery of the data type, you now store your data in S3 buckets in a way that will be less costly. And of course, even if you don't know the storage pattern of your data on AWS cloud, you can always use the AWS S3 intelligent tiering, where AWS will actually help you to manage storage based on your frequency or your access pattern for your data. So for the S3 level, you can talk about maximizing the storage class and using intelligent tiering for cost optimization. Then equally at the EC2 level or at the compute level, you want to focus more on this type of compute resources which you are using for your applications. So you don't want to set up a C5 or a TX or an MAMD very large EC2 instance to perform basic application workload. You can use specific compute resources that match your application requirement. And then equally, you can also make use of the AWS. AWS has different models of EC2 instances. We have the on-demand instances, spot instances, reserved instances, and we even have the dedicated hosts. Based on the type of application which you are running, you can make use of the spot instance for applications that are not critical and that you can mitigate failures. Maybe if you are running a big data application that you mitigate failures, you can use spot instances on AWS. But if you just want to run a simple test or a simple deployment, you can use an on-demand instance where you pay hourly. And if you are very certain about your access pattern for your data or your compute requirement on the cloud, you can then go in for a reserved instance where you have a very big discount for you signing up to use that particular instance between a year and 3. Then equally, of course, the dedicated host is another instance last option which you can use. Also, for you to manage your compute resources on AWS for cost optimization, you can use AWS auto scaling. Auto scaling will ensure that if you don't have an idea on your compute requirement, you can have a minimum or a desired capacity of compute requirement, where the AWS auto scaling function will help you to increase server capacity or decrease server capacity to meet your traffic. That's another way which you can optimize costs at the compute level. Another way which you can optimize costs is by going serverless. With serverless, especially with a service like AWS Lambda, we pay only for runtime of your application with AWS Lambda. So you can use AWS serverless for some applications for cost optimization. Based on your entire infrastructure setup, you can use the AWS Trusted Advisor service that will help you to give a lot more detail on how to perform or how to optimize costs in your environment. Trusted Advisor or AWS Cost Explorer, those are all services that you can use to monitor your environment and to optimize costs. So make sure you mention all of these services in your interview. And again, like I mentioned, we have taken time to carefully walk you through all these services: security, storage, database, compute, and a lot more in our previous videos. You want to watch the videos that are specific to all these services that I've mentioned. The next question which you can probably be asked as far as usage of AWS is concerned is how you perform a migration from an on-premise deployment to the cloud. And this comes with you using the various AWS migration services. And for AWS migration services, the very first service, which of course you should mention, you want to talk about the AWS Application Discovery Service, ADS, where the Application Discovery Service will help you to first do an analysis of your on-premise environment and to know the current state of resources on the on-premise before you moving those resources to the cloud. There's the AWS Application Discovery Service that gives you a detailed summary of all your current infrastructure on-premise, the compute, everything that you need to know about your on-premise infrastructure. And then from there, you can do a performance analysis of the same requirement which you will need on the cloud. So AWS ADS service helps you to have an understanding of your on-premise environment. For a general case at the consulting level, you can make use of the Cloud Assessment Readiness tool, which AWS has, the CART. AWS has a Cloud Assessment Readiness tool, which you can use to perform analysis of readiness, if the company is actually ready to migrate their information from the on-premise to the cloud. Now, we also have the database migration service on AWS, where database schema, of course, if you're having an infrastructure on-premise, there's a lot of databases that have to do your application. So the moment you want to migrate that application from on-premise to the cloud, you need to make use of a system that will enable you to perform migration of database on-premise to database on the cloud, and that is where we use the database migration service on AWS. Now, the AWS database migration service enables you to perform migration of the various data types, sequential databases and non-sequential databases, from on-premise to the cloud. And if you're migrating perhaps maybe your MySQL or your Oracle or your Microsoft SQL or your MongoDB on-premise to the cloud, you now have the AWS RDS service, which helps you to migrate from on-premise to the cloud. So you want to talk about the AWS database migration service. And of course, we equally have the application migration service that helps you to migrate your applications from on-premise to the cloud. Lastly, for migration, you want to mention the use of schema conversion tools. Schema conversion tools help us to perform conversion of database from one schema to the other, MySQL to Postgre or whatever the case may be. That's the last service which you can talk about as far as your experience with migration on AWS is concerned. That's a list of some of the common AWS questions that you can be asked during interviews. If you are not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and if you're a returning subscriber, thank you for subscribing to our videos. Of course, we are producing a lot more videos to help you to stay relevant in your cloud computing journey. And join the Slack community with the link in the description. Hit the notification bell so that every time we have a similar video, you will have access to these videos firsthand. See you in the next video.